1937, when the Marijuana Tax Act was established, there were no data of any sort, much less scientific, about whether this compound was harmful or not. There was just evidence it was being used by people whom we distrusted and feared, and that it was associated with lower class people.
You go back and read the record in Congress, it's amazing the lack of information. There were literally questions by members of Congress saying, what is this marijuana? Is it a narcotic or what is it? And there would be a sentence, someone would stand up and say, oh, it's the most dangerous new drug coming down the pipe.
In terms of what Congress knew in 1937, they didn't know any of that history. The only history that they were given was all these cock and bull stories about how it made people crazy and they went out and killed people under the influence of marijuana.
The Tax Act was built on lies, and I think it's outrageous that we have legislation that still exists today it was based on lies.
Despite opposition by the American Medical Association, Congress passed the law unanimously after debating for a grand total of 90 seconds. President Franklin D. Roosevelt signed it into law on August 3, 1937. Theoretically, the new law did not actually prohibit marijuana and hemp. Only a constitutional amendment could do that. But by imposing prohibitive taxes and mountains of red tape, it made cultivation, processing, sales, and any use of the hemp plant whatsoever virtually impossible. Technically, farmers could still legally grow a hemp plant like this one, but only if they could somehow grow it without the leaves and flowers. This law is still in effect today. The full reasons behind marijuana prohibition are still being debated. Some experts think racism played a part.
So that when poor people, immigrants, take the drugs, we're afraid they're going to rise up, smite, steal, and take the white women. And so we outlaw the drugs because of our fears over that.
Others think Harry Anslinger was motivated by ambition and power.
A great deal of the reason that marijuana was prohibited was because of self-aggrandizement at the federal level, especially with Harry Anslinger wanting to be the J. Edgar Hoover of his own agency.
Jack sees darker motives. His book alleges a high-level conspiracy revolving around Anslinger, Treasury Secretary Andrew Mellon, the DuPont Chemical Company, and hemp. Before the Civil War, hemp was the nation's second-largest cash crop behind cotton. But while cotton could be processed by machine, slaves were the only cost-effective way to separate the tough hemp fiber from the pulpy core that was used to make paper. When slavery ended after the war, the hemp industry went into decline. The death knell was sounded in the late 1800s when paper makers converted to tree-based pulp.
It meant that you could chop down a forest a lot cheaper than you could pay laborers to manufacture hemp fiber for paper.
Jack hangs his conspiracy angle on events that happened simultaneously with marijuana prohibition. Coincidence number one. A German immigrant invented a machine called the decorticator. This new mechanical processing device was about to bring hemp into the modern industrial age. Popular Mechanics magazine recognized the potential bonanza for American farmers and entrepreneurs. This article heralded a machine that could process hemp quickly and cheaply for the first time in history. Coincidence number two. The DuPont company in the 30s came out with both a sulfuric acid method for making paper from trees and a new invention called plastic. Jack's book points out that a hemp resurgence would certainly have been a serious threat to DuPont's petrochemical strategies. And finally, there's millionaire financier Andrew Mellon. Mellon was Anslinger's boss, Harry's wife's uncle, and DuPont's banker. Coincidences number 3, 4, and 5.
smoke all of my grass.
The book's credibility got a boost from Jack's discovery of this 14-minute documentary. Supposedly made by the U.S. government 5 years after the Marijuana Tax Act. Its purpose was to encourage farmers to grow outlawed hemp during World War II.
Long ago, when these ancient Grecian temples were new, hemp was already old in the service of mankind. For thousands of years even then, this plant had been grown for cordage and coarse cloth in China and elsewhere in the East. But now, with Philippine and East Indian sources of hemp in the hands of the Japanese, and shipment of jute from India curtailed, American hemp must meet the needs of our Army and Navy as well as of our industries. In 1942, patriotic farmers, at the government's request, planted 36,000 acres of seed hemp, an increase of several thousand%. The goal for 1943 is 50,000 acres of seed hemp. For to grow hemp legally, you must have a federal registration and tax stamp. This is provided for in your contract. Ask your AAA committeeman or your county agent about it. Don't forget,
Jack often staged public showings of Hemp for Victory to validate his history of the plant. He also used the film as an example of government deception and hypocrisy. But he was stunned one day in 1988 to get a call from a newspaper reporter questioning the authenticity of the film.
Well, Mr. Herer, we went out to check the information, and we found nobody that would corroborate your story, that this movie was even ever made. You said this movie was made by the United States government, this movie Hemp for Victory, that if there would be any evidence that the government ever made such a film, it would be in the Library of Congress, it would be in the Department of Agriculture. It is in neither place.
His reputation on the line, Jack and his friends went on an excursion to Washington, D.C.
We were just determined to find the documentation that made it a credible government movie made by the U.S. government and not made by Jack. We didn't see it as detective work. We just saw it as we were on a mission. We're on a mission from God.
Many others before Jack had searched the Library of Congress for proof of the documentary's existence and found none. In a day of digging, Jack ran into the same lack of evidence.
After deciding to give up, we decided to give it one more try.
In a dusty old book, hidden among clutter in a back room, they found it. The official Library of Congress documentation. Indeed, the film had been made by the U.S. Department of Agriculture.
Hemp for Victory.
In the few short years since The Emperor Wears No Clothes first began inspiring activists and entrepreneurs, the U.S. hemp industry has grown from Jack's ramshackle Venice Beach booth into a $100 million a year business.
I was shopping for a suit the other day and walked into the department store. Stepped on the elevator and told the girl, dry goods flow. When I got off, a salesman come up to me. He said, now what can I do for you? I said, well, go in there and show me all in sport clothes, like you supposed to. He said, well, sure, come on in, buddy, and dig these fabrics we got laid out on the shelf. He said,
pick yourself out one, try it on, stand in the mirror and dig yourself.
The world's getting this information. It's coming out on billboards. It's coming out in companies all over, everywhere.
As hemp gained mainstream acceptance in the 90s, so did Jack. His critics became allies.
When Steve Hager became editor of High Times in the late 80s, and he went ahead and just wrote column after column article after article, month after month in his magazine, and that's really what exploded the idea of hemp, more to the colleges, more to everybody that picked up a High Times now read about hemp.
In 1994, he was honored by the conservative Drug Policy Foundation in Washington.
With his efforts for showing the impact one individual can have on the lives of many others, Jack Herer is awarded the 1994 Robert C. Randall Award for achievement in the field of citizen action.
At the awards dinner, the emperor wore a hemp suit.
Leaning on a tree trunk, thinking all the same junk, falling in and out of a dream. Back and forth I'm swaying, I'm contemplating staying, laying and...
But nothing vindicated Jack more than a 1992 Lifetime Achievement Award from his longtime adversary, Normal.
How do I calm myself at times like these? I need a simple kind of lovely, and the thought is just a novelty.
From a nemesis to a prophet, I think, is the way to look at it. He was a bother and troublesome until we began to realize he had really discovered very important aspect of why it is that marijuana should be reconsidered and why the illegality of it is so preposterous and unfair.
I think that Jack's place in the history of anti-prohibition movement is going to be secured by the simple fact that he, despite everybody's criticisms, everybody thinking he was crazy, that he had the persistence and the temerity to simply keep going on and saying the truth over and over and over again, no matter, it sometimes seems like you have to say the truth many times before anybody hears it.
The Emperor Wears No Clothes is a book that's had an enormous impact in this country on awakening millions of Americans to the fact that the marijuana laws are wrong, that they're based on false premises, that they're racial in nature, and that we need to change them. I don't know anyone who's had as much impact as Jack has.
Neither Jack nor anyone else in the outgunned, outspent reform movement was having any impact at all on U.S. drug policies. In the last years of the 20th century, incredibly, America was the only industrialized nation that still forbid hemp farming, forcing the U.S. hemp industry to import all its raw material. According to the government, allowing farmers to grow hemp would confuse police and send a wrong message to children.
Drugs are every nation's problem, and every nation must act to fight them. We are determined to build a drug-free America and to join with others to combat drugs around the world. Let there be no doubt, this is ultimately a struggle for human freedom.
In the 90s, the federal government escalated the war on marijuana, spending a record amount of money to arrest a record number of Americans, most for simple possession. Since Prohibition began in 1937, upwards of 70 million Americans have tried marijuana at least once. A staggering 11 million of them have been arrested. With 1 in every 40 prisoners a marijuana offender, the United States has become the world's biggest jailer. Some states now spend more on prisons than on higher education.
Even alcohol prohibition did not punish the users of alcohol. When marijuana prohibition was instituted, however, the prohibition was aimed directly at users, which it had not been with alcohol prohibition.
Well, just here in America, it's 14 million years have been spent on prison, jails, parole, or probation since the 1930s for marijuana. 14 million years. I can't even begin to calculate what that is at $25,000, $30,000 a year now. It gets me angry every day.
All available research has concluded that marijuana is dangerous to our health. Marijuana limits learning and memory, perception and judgment, and our ability to drive a car.
The war on marijuana is also a war on the sick and dying. Even after California and 5 other states overwhelmingly approved medical marijuana initiatives in the late 90s, the federal government still plays hardball.
Despite these initiatives, we want to make clear that federal law still applies, and federal officials will continue to apply the law, and DEA officials will review cases, as they have, to determine whether to revoke the registration of any physician who recommends or prescribes so-called Schedule I controlled substances.
This is not a medical initiative. This is a legalization of drugs issue.
The federal government, by classifying marijuana in Schedule I, is saying that it has no medical uses, which is a bald-faced lie because it has 10,000 years in every culture of medical use.
United States policy to the contrary, cannabis has long been esteemed as a safe, effective, and non-addicting medicine. For thousands of years, it was prescribed by the greatest physicians of their day. It was used for dozens of conditions, ranging from migraines, chronic pain, and asthma, to childbirth, muscle spasms, and even depression. Today, it also provides relief for victims of multiple sclerosis, glaucoma, the AIDS wasting syndrome, and nausea induced by chemotherapy.
It's impossible for a human to overdose and die, which is not true of alcohol, nicotine, barbiturates, or morphine. And it's a drug which humans can use under a wide variety of circumstances with safety.
Even so, U.S. House Republicans, using language that would have made Harry Anslinger proud, passed a resolution in 1998 branding marijuana a dangerous, addictive drug with no medical use.
They don't care if marijuana is the only drug that can alleviate your pain and suffering so that you can live longer, so that you can take your chemotherapy, so that you have a reasonable quality of life. They would rather fight the war on drugs even though they know that there are sick and dying patients being denied relief because of their position. Unconscionable.
So you would think that after at least a generation of really good information about marijuana being circulated, why is the war still going on?
One, I think the people in charge of government today, particularly in the law enforcement sections of government, are people who are afraid of the culture around marijuana. It harkens back to the Vietnam War era, Vietnam War protests, the civil rights protests, people who are trying to change the government.
But notwithstanding that people talk about how the police are not particularly interested in marijuana cases, in fact, it is their bread and butter.
The war on drugs is supported in part now because we have a drug abuse establishment. Every place I turn and talk to somebody about what he or she does, he's in drug abuse treatment, drug abuse prevention, drug abuse education, urine testing, interdiction. He's a policeman, an undercover investigator, a jail builder, a jail keeper. I sometimes think there's nobody left in the United States except a few of us and all the people who are making their living fighting the war on drugs.
They used to call us the land of the free, and now they call us the land of the pea, where you have to pee to be tested to be free. What a crock.
All you have to do is say the word drugs, and you can change the Constitution so that it's meaningless. You can search people's homes without valid cause. You can seize people's property without valid cause. You can seize people's lives and destroy families. They talk about family values. how many thousands of families have been destroyed by these vicious laws.
Not another medicine, not another drug on this planet that nobody has ever died from. Nobody has ever died from marijuana that wasn't shot by a cop.
Jack Herer. Have I pronounced it correctly, Jack?
Herer.
Herer. Herer. Okay. Jack Herer.
Jack Herer.
Jack Herer.
Jack Herer.
This to Jack Herer.
We're gonna put on Jack Herer.
Hemp.
Once a captain Dan tell me a story about this lovely girl whose name was Jane.
Cult acclaim has not made Jack a household name, nor does he live like an emperor. Most of his income from book sales goes to finance his causes, not his lifestyle. When he's not on the road for weeks at a time campaigning for hemp and medical marijuana, Jack lives and works in this small, cramped apartment in Van Nuys, California.
The great Titanic, yes, it's she.
There he is, singer.
Jack is a cultural icon. He is probably as well known as anyone who's ever had an opinion to offer on this subject. He is better known than probably anyone else who works on the marijuana law reform issue. He is a phenomenon that's been very positive.
Uneasy rests the crown on he who would save the world. Jack enters the new millennium still grieving over the untimely death of Captain Ed Adair, taken by leukemia in 1991 at the age of 51.
We have been together 19 years, the greatest friend a guy could ever have. He worked so hard to save this planet, and he believed he was saving it for you, me, his children, and he thought that this was the way to do it.
And it's against the law, the federal law, and it's a stupid law, it's an ignorant law, and it's an evil law, because they know better, and they won't get off of it.
Captain Ed and I planned was to get out and teach this information. Eventually we would get a cadre of believers, and eventually they would go out and teach the world. And now we know that we've succeeded.
And now we understand so much about the man. He's not insane, he is not crazy. He's not the devil in disguise. So listen closely to the winds of change and see the world, see the world, oh see the world through his eyes.
Despite some health problems, Jack has no plans to kick back and take it easy with longtime companion Jeannie Hawkins. With the publishing of the 11th edition of The Emperor Wears No Clothes in late 1998, Jack's schedule is more hectic than ever, taking him and his message around the world. Jack is haunted, however, by the hard, cold facts of prohibition. Despite its undeniable potential as the natural, renewable alternative to a synthetic world, the hemp plant, by federal law, still cannot be cultivated in the United States. Despite increasing public and scientific support, the medical use of marijuana still remains illegal. And despite the enormous cost in money and human lives, millions of people are still being arrested for possessing a therapeutic substance revered by our ancestors. This is the reality of America's war on a plant. A war born of commerce and greed. An endless war. And so, the fight goes on. And on.
I don't know if hemp's going to save the world, but I'll tell you this. It's the only thing that can. USS Constitution, what we call Old Ironsides, became famous during the War of 1812. Conestoga wagons and the wagons that went west were covered with hempen canvas. The Constitution had 60 tons of hemp on it. The sails, the ropes, the flags, the books, the Bibles, the maps. The word canvas is just the Dutch pronunciation of cannabis.
Everybody said you was deadly. Yes, you know you always was deadly.
The sealant between the loose and green beams was all oakum made from hemp. Canvas sails were cannabis sails. Canvas-covered wagons were cannabis-covered wagons.
Well, I tried and tried, but you just can't get enough.
11 acres of farms had to be growing in constant production every year for nothing else than the hemp. It took 3,600 man-hours to make the sails and the ropes for this ship each year. And they went along, and all the oil on the wheels was always made with hemp seed oil because they didn't have any petroleum oil. And they never had a better oil than hemp seed oil. And I just thought I'd be a wise guy a little bit, but a nice wise guy. And I said, you know what those sails were made of? And he says, nylon. I said, no. I said, no, I mean, not 20 years ago, 10 years ago. I'm talking about 1812. What were the sails made of? He said, nylon. How's that?
Through things they shouldn't be living through, like flat mold and electrical problems and alarms going off every hour, and they can't even get a good night's sleep, and then they're turned into slaves that work for $1 a day, and there's a prison system that's replaced our slavery system. And if you look at history, that's exactly what happened. You know, we had slavery, in the same year we abolished slavery, we started building prisons. And so we never really got rid of slavery, we just labeled it differently. And we live in a government, and I don't know how many of you realize it, but they've labeled you already because they tell you you're a consumer. And what does that word mean? It means to consume. They teach addiction 24 hours a day with television, with newspaper ads, with magazine articles, you know, and that's what they do. They sell you things to consume, you know, and they're not, they want to tell you that they're anti-drug, but they're not anti-drug. They want to be the only drug dealers in the world. As long as it's a man-made drug and they can patent it and they can get rich from it, then they got no problem with it. You know, and if it's not a man-made drug, well, then there's an issue. And they would like to think they're gods. They really like to think they're gods. You know, they make